So this is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Everyone recognises that in the end there will have to be a negotiated solution to this conflict. But it's for the Ukrainians.
With the Ukrainians declaring, having driven everyone out of their country. Okay, so you're in the room. Would you offer more money than the government is offering?
There's going to have to be compromise. It's not just about pay.
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you. People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things, and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And we may say all your examples.
My name's Andy Bell, and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, we bring context and understanding to a big story in the news by talking to people with real insight. This week, can Rishi do it? After pushing through his plan for Northern Ireland with only a small rebellion from his own MPs, and with Boris Johnson's continuing problems over Partygate, can the Prime Minister not only be confident of staying party leader, but even start mapping a path to winning the next election? I've been talking to polling analyst, lifelong observer of the Conservative Party, and Westminster legend, Lord Robert Hayward. Robert Hayward, thanks very much for coming in to talk to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? And we're talking about the Conservative Party. First of all, did you sense in recent events around the vote on the Northern Ireland, the Windsor Framework, around maybe Boris Johnson's evidence to the Privileges Committee, did you sense inside the party some kind of shift?
The shift had been developing slightly before those events, a stronger affinity towards Rishi. But there's no question that particularly the Northern Ireland Windsor Framework and then the budget, general sense that he's really beginning to establish himself as Prime Minister, not only with the parliamentary party, but also it's beginning to show up in the polls as well.
I mean, not long ago, people were talking about Boris Johnson returning. Quite a lot of people quietly, but quite seriously, saying this is a possibility, maybe even a probability. Where do you think we are with that?
Someone doing it not so quietly, but there's no question it's still there. There are those who want Boris to come back, but his opportunities have diminished. But there is still one very major political event, i.e. the local elections on May the 4th. We may see other things as well, by which Rishi will be judged. But overall, I think the possibility of him being replaced by Boris or anybody have diminished markedly. And the Tory party would be a joke if they actually went for another change.
I mean, sticking with Boris Johnson in terms of his potential or not return, what do you think has done him, or what has changed? Was it the evidence he gave to the Privileges Committee? Was it the evidence of the people voting with him on the Northern Ireland Framework? Is it a bit of both?
I think it's particularly those people who have become ever more impressed by Rishi. It's not so much a negative towards Boris, although I'll come to that in a second, but it is a positive towards Rishi. On top of which then you have got what you identified just then, i.e. the number of people who didn't vote with Boris. He clearly cast a net out saying, I'm going to be voting against, with the intention, whether he had the intention or his supporters had the intention, of pulling other people into dissent. And it didn't work. And
21 other Conservative
21
MPs.
others, including Liz Truss. And that is a strikingly small number. And what has now happened is, thinking of all the MPs who were elected either in 2017 or 2019, they've never experienced a united party in the whole of their parliamentary career. And actually, they're beginning to quite like it.
Is what's happening that Brexit relations with the EU are becoming less of an issue within the party? Is that part of what's happening?
I think it's twofold. One is that Brexit 2016 was the referendum. You've had a passage of time. But also, Rishi's negotiations over the Northern Ireland framework have been incredibly successful. So people are now looking at the other problems associated with the EU in terms of scientific agreements, trade arrangements and the like, education arrangements. And they're beginning to view them in a more positive sense, that they can actually be dealt with serious conversations. And therefore, it's a combination of both time and attention to detail which have changed the circumstances for Brexit.
We'll come on to talking about Rishi's approach in a second, but just sticking with that thought, I'll just put something to you. I mean, it's possible to look at every Conservative Prime Minister we've had, possibly even going back to Margaret Thatcher, but maybe not, but certainly John Major, to say they were essentially defined or broken by the EU and by Britain's relations with the EU. Could Rishi be the first one to move beyond that?
He could be the first one to actually enhance his position in terms of, because of the conversations and negotiations that he's had with the EU. I'd only say to you, the Tory party normally breaks its leaders on foreign affairs. You can go way back beyond Mrs. Thatcher to Suez crisis and all sorts of other things. Historically, the Tory party has always been obsessive about some form of foreign affairs. As I say, the EU is the most recent example, but sadly, when I was a lad, it was the Commonwealth.
So the Conservative Party, I think it may be fair to say that it wasn't in love with Rishi Sunak. I mean, let's face it, he lost the contest when the members decided and Liz Truss won. Is there evidence that, let's start with the membership are warming to Rishi Sunak?
Yes, I think the vote for Liz Truss wasn't solely a vote against Rishi, question mark the extent to which it was any vote against him. But Liz Truss ran a very shrewd campaign. There were two big issues as far as the membership was concerned. One was that she was perceived as being the daughter of Boris, and therefore all the Boris natural supporters wanted to go to Liz Truss. And secondly, Rishi set out his message as being steady as she goes. And the members felt that the public at large was so concerned about the cost of living crisis that a simple no change message wasn't going to work. And therefore, she actually not only had the natural support of one group, but she had an appeal because people knew that something had to be done.
And then the something that had to be done didn't work under Liz Truss. Is there evidence now that those people are coming around and saying, oh, I guess we kind of get what he was on about and we quite like the cut of his jib and what he's doing in terms of competence, etc.?
The sense that he has provided a degree of economic stability, that actually the problems, most of them, can be tackled by a coherent economic strategy, added to which you have this very attractive personality which people are discovering, the warmth, the smile, the attention to detail. All those things have provided a foundation onto which he then puts the Northern Ireland framework and the budget. And there's no question that people are warming to him as an individual.
And he did get the support of a majority of MPs when he was running, when he lost first time round. But there was also I remember having conversations with MPs who were very much anybody but Rishi at that stage. It was partly based around this perception he'd been disloyal to Boris Johnson, but also partly they just didn't feel he was going to work for them and for their constituencies. Is there evidence that those people, and you've hinted at this already, that those people, those MPs are coming around to Rishi Sunak?
There is no question that the whole party is moving towards Rishi, depending on from where they started. The absolutely committed to Boris, there are those that are still there, but they are moving closer to Rishi. Those who had doubts about him have moved to actually, he's looking quite good. And then, as you say, the majority of the MPs who were themselves originally voting for Rishi have become much clearer and are now willing to say to you, well, I told you so, this is the route by which we might actually win the next election.
Well, you've anticipated my next question, which is, we've been getting used to the idea that Conservatives have kind of blown their credibility, if I can put it that way, in the autumn of last year on the economy, that there's very serious issues of trust related to the Boris Johnson time as Prime Minister. People have kind of come around maybe more quickly than they expected to assuming that the more likely outcome at the next election is Keir Starmer in number 10. That's just a sort of perception of people. But do you think there is a route to victory for the Conservatives?
The balance of probability for any government which has been in power something like 13 to 15 to 18 years is that they're going to lose. They've run out of steam. But the polling evidence shows that large numbers of the people who voted Conservative in 2019 have actually moved to don't knows. And very few of them, although Labour has this huge vote in the opinion polls, that vote doesn't appear to be solid. But it's particularly that first group of don't knows who can easily be pulled back. And what we are seeing in this slow trend in the opinion polls and in the very few council by-elections that we have at this time of year, they both match up that people are coming back to the Conservative Party, not having gone to another party as yet, but the ones who actually just didn't know where they were going to vote. They're people who always vote, but they were just saying at this stage, I don't know how I'm going to vote. And there is some evidence that those are the people who are warming to Rishi, and they are probably mostly in what one would describe as the middle-class counties of England, the Cheshires, the Warwickshires, the Surreys of this world, the previously solid Conservative seats, which might have been under threat to the Lib Dems. And there's a sense now that, well, those are the people that are firming up in the first instance.
Is there a structural problem for the Conservative leadership, though, in terms of you're looking at two quite different sets of voters? The one you've just mentioned, the more the voters associated maybe with Southern England in terms of sort of maybe traditional Conservatives, and obviously the so-called red wall that Boris Johnson won in 2019. Can you run a coherent election strategy that appeals to both of those groups?
It's actually more complicated than that because there's a third group, which is, you've identified what I referred to as the middle class constituencies. Those are the ones you have to count on in the first instance. The red wall seats, if I can use the term, which I don't particularly like, but they're the ones who delivered a very large majority. But they're not the ones that actually deliver a majority, i.e. you just get over the line. For them, you have to look at the traditional marginal seats, which are not red wall and they're not solidly middle class. The party is trying to get a message across to the red wall seats in terms of small boats, in terms of law and order, and that's a directional issue. But in the normal marginal seats, which would deliver a Tory majority up to 20 or 30 as against the 80 which the Tory party had in 2019, are actually a social mix. Most constituencies have a combination of middle-class areas and working-class areas and inner-city areas. And those are the traditional marginals. And I think what you'll see over the coming months is much greater attention paid to those sorts of constituencies, the Dartfords of this world, the Broxtows, there's seats around Bromsgrove, Dudley.
The seats where Labour are the threat, not the Liberal Democrats.
Labour are the threat, but ones which change hands at successive general elections. And you and all your colleagues have reporters at those counts because they are the ones that deliver the majority in one way or another.
So is that almost like a reversion to normal electoral practice in some way?
It is. I think what you'll find is moving away from the attention to what gave a Conservatives a huge majority to the question mark, can the Conservatives or Labour have an overall majority? And those are the seats which are traditional marginals.
So to win, what does Rishi Sunak have to do? Does he just have to keep doing what he's doing, which is showing competence and, look, I can work sensibly with our neighbours and we don't have to be in a constant state of tension with them, and I'm slowly, look, inflation has come down and maybe we can get some tax cuts in the next budget before the next election. Is that all he has to do?
There's two stages to it. One is the process that we're seeing at the moment, which is this steady solidifying of the Conservatives and the don't know Conservatives, if I can use that term. You solidify that vote first so that there's no talk about finishing up with 50 or 100 seats. You're getting up towards the 200 plus seats.
You lock in your base.
Lock in that group. And then you start, and that is the first phase, locking that base in, is going on now and will for the rest of the year towards the party conference in October. After which you then move on and say, OK, we've proved we're competent. We've proved we've put behind us the events of 2022. I'm offering you better relations with the EU, better financial circumstances in terms of cost of living. I'm coping with those issues. Now, because we've got a solidified base financially, we will look at things like tax cuts and other general policy matters.
I mean, because one of the arguments you've heard, or one has heard recently and still here, is that Rishi's fine, up to a point. Rishi is the sort of Gordon Brown candidate going into the election. You basically know you're going to lose at the end of it, but you lose respectably. And the argument from those who still hanker for Boris is what you need is something that changes things up, a candidate who we know appeals in the so-called red wall seats and elsewhere, and that's the game changer you need. What do you think of that? I
think what's happening is that people are moving away from that perception of Rishi. I wouldn't challenge you that he was there initially to provide stability and provide those MPs who were in those traditional Conservative middle-class seats in the South East, in the Midlands and in the North, certainty, to give them certainty first. But I think what one's now in a position of seeing is the perception that actually he's popular with the public. His ratings are well ahead of the parties. And that says he has the potential to drag the party up to his level. Now, under those circumstances, not only do you pull back you'll never pull back all of the don't know Conservatives, as I've described them, but other people who will then deliver the overall majority. The route is there. It diminishes with time if you don't get it right, if the strikes continue, if cost of living issues don't come down. But he is providing that narrow pathway which people, as you say, didn't think was there previously. It was just, we'll lose, but we'll lose gracefully rather than lose disgracefully.
What is the Conservative Party now? Broadening this out again, what does it stand for? Is it a party of economics and small government and low taxes, but fundamentally a kind of economic approach to how you manage Britain? Is it now much more about values, as we hear? I mean, sort of not a phrase that, again, probably a lot of people don't like, but this sort of culture war idea. It's like you what actually gets people to vote is to say if they believe they're on one side of this line or the other when it comes to issues, whether it's immigration or even something like trans issues and all that sort of stuff. Is that becoming more important in terms of defining how people end up voting?
No, I think it's the first field of economic issues. The traditional Conservatives have always done well in answer to the question, what issues do you think you regard the Conservatives are better at as against the Labour Party? Economic management has always been top of Conservative Party ratings, the capacity to manage the economy in the interests of the broadest group of people. The Conservatives do badly on things like the NHS, etc. What Rishi is in the process of doing is re-establishing that credibility, the sense that actually the Tory party can cope. Boris was a great populist, But the number of people I've had said recently, well, actually, it was never Conservative. We had all these great projects, bridges, boats, whatever it may happen to be, but don't worry about financial controls. Now, what Rishi is doing is saying, well, actually, financial controls do matter. And he's been willing to say to people, I want tax cuts now, to say, no, we can't deliver them. So there's no question. The direction in the first instance, that the main headline is financial competence, managerial competence. The issues you referred to are things which the party will touch on, but all the polling says they are less important than things like cost of living issues.
And the idea of returning to sound financial management as central presumably was given a boost by what happened under Liz Truss, and that there's a sense that the idea of let's have some tax cuts and we'll worry about how we pay for them later, but this is what's needed, that's kind of been discredited as a result of her time in power.
It has been thoroughly trashed. Whether, as she argues, the message was wrong and we didn't get the message right and we could have done it, but Rishi is pursuing a different course. He's making clear, and if you listen to him, he will re-emphasise this towards the end of any set of comments, that I want further tax cuts. I want to go down that route, but I'm not willing to until I'm absolutely sure that the economy is stable. And the general sense is that people are responding to that and will continue to do so if the cost of living falls, the rate of inflation falls. Now, last month's figures were not good, and there is a risk that he will lose the ear of the public because inflation is not coming down quickly enough. But at the moment, there is a sense people are listening because there is the message is getting home. Cost of living, despite the problems, is coming down. We can deliver tax cuts, but it will take time.
It does feel, I'll be interested to see what you think. I mean, people look back at, for instance, the time with John Major in power. First of all, he won a surprise victory in 1992 and hung on when people were expecting them to lose. But very quickly, we had the episode of Black Wednesday when the UK was forced down to the exchange rate mechanism at the time. And basically, the received wisdom now is that broke them and they couldn't come back. The sense had been, until quite recently, a similar kind of, dare I say, life-threatening experience had gone on for the Conservatives through a sort of long period involving Boris Johnson, then with trust issues, then on top of that, the Truss episode, and that basically the game's over. You clearly think that you can't just say that.
No, I don't think you can. The great advantage that John Major did have, and the date sequence is so strikingly similar, in that he and Rishi came to power in the autumn, or in one case 1990, in one case 2022, with an election that's expected 18, 20 months later. In the case of John Major, he had the opportunity to get rid of the poll tax. That had a dramatic effect, and that helped him gain the success of 1992. Other factors worked in his favour, but that was the initial big thing. Rishi hasn't had that opportunity. He's trying to deliver that coup by progressive competence. So there is a parallel. The key question is whether it actually works. It wasn't even certain that it was going to work for John Major until the election results came through on the night.
I remember,
in 1992. Well, I lost that night, but that's another matter.
Sorry about that.
But that's all right. We'll live. We're here. But the two scenarios are the ones that people are looking at in Westminster. There's no question. We've got to the position now where people are saying, well, there is a route through. And significantly, it's beginning to worry the Labour Party. I've got colleagues in the Labour Party who are far less confident than they were only a few weeks ago. They were telling you that, oh, well, I've got people who I'm talking to who voted Conservative all their lives and they're never going to do so again. Those same people don't have that confidence now. They still think they're going to win, but it's not the confidence. And therefore, the 1992 route is beginning to look a serious option on both sides of the political fence.
Okay, I'm going to be very mean now and ask you to make Two predictions, which is always maybe one slightly easier than the other. One, will Rishi Sunak lead the Conservatives into the next election?
Yes. I've said just now that the public would not countenance a change in leadership, and I believe that the party now knows that.
And two, will he be Prime Minister after the next election?
I can't even predict the local government elections in May, let alone the general election.
But you think there may be a route for him to get there?
There's a route. Whether he actually achieves it in the end, I don't know, and won't know until we're into the election campaign.
Lord Hayward, Robert Hayward, thanks very much for gazing into your crystal ball and also giving us all that analysis. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Robert Hayward with his assessment of the narrow path to a Conservative victory. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. How Did We Get Here is a Channel 5 podcast produced by Silvia Maresca. Please share, rate and review. I'm Andy Bell, and there will be another episode along soon.